So what is Xdebug? Xdebug is a debugging toolkit written by a gentleman named Derek Rethens. He developed this tool in 2002, and basically it started off as a tool for online stepping through code and doing back traces and capturing performance data from code running in real time on your website. It's a compiled module that you get from PECL, and if you have control of your own server, you simply run sudo PECL install Xdebug, and in a matter of moments you'll have it compiled and installed on your server. If you have a Windows machine, you can download a DLL, drop it in the right directory, and it'll just start working for you. So let's get started with just a really basic site that I've got set up here. If anybody wants to follow along or poke through the website, the pages I've got available, the IP address is right here, 172.16.5.218. That's it. And so we're looking at welcome.html right now. And we will be spending most of our time in the feed sifter directory. So this is a very modified version of a website that I built several years ago. Most of my websites are simple little utilities that I saw were lacking on the internet, or I felt I could do a better job, or I just wanted to have a whack at it so I could have the learning experience. And so what this does is takes any RSS atom feed that you have out there and filters it for items that you want. So it's the holiday season. We all like shopping at Amazon, and Amazon's got a really cool service called Gold Box. Maybe you're familiar with this. It's similar to Woot or something like that, where you can look at a new item for sale every day in various categories. There's a lot of really cool stuff here. They've got the biggest RSS feed I've seen come through my service. It is hundreds of elements long, and it's a bit absurd. But it's actually good for us because we can take this Gold Box RSS feed, plug it into Feed Sifter, and say, look for some holiday items. What do you guys want for Christmas?
2 front teeth.
2 front
60-inch
teeth.
LCD.
LCD. Maybe not a plasma to go with it.
Not in California.
No, that's right. And for my kid.
Oh, see if you can find one of those hamster toy things that are all the rage. Does anybody know what those are?
I don't know what they'd
Yeah.
be called, but I'll find a row or I'll find an RSS entry that has the words toys, hamster, toys and hamster, and why not? So this should return a lot of items. Let's find out. So what this does is create.php simply creates an RSS feed URL that actually doesn't do anything aside from stick that information on the URL. And when you click the subscribe link here, it downloads that feed from the internet and filters out just what we want. So we've got camcorders, laptops, plasmas, a thingy, and a severe lack of hamsters and Miley Cyrus. Oh well. But there's some debug in here. I don't want this going live with debug on every single line item, right? That looks bad. That's embarrassing. Probably shouldn't do that. So let's start by stepping through our code to figure out where that's happening. So I've opened up NetBeans here. I've got a copy of my code downloaded on my site, but I've also configured my project in NetBeans. How many people are familiar with NetBeans?
About half the people in the room, I guess.
All right. NetBeans is a great free IDE. I'm not sure if it's based on Eclipse or not. Maybe somebody can speak authoritatively. It's not. Okay.
It's from Sun, isn't it?
Yet it's from Sun. Okay.
I think so.
Yet another Java IDE that is better than the last, I would say. I used to use Zen Studio 5 for. I used it for several years, and this finally convinced me to move off of it. So my project here is configured to debug on the VM that I have running within this Mac. It calls that host name whenever I tell it to run debug, and it puts a whole bunch of arguments on the query string, similar items that I searched for earlier today. So when I hit, I want to debug index.php, the file that actually served up this filtered RSS feed. When I want to debug that page, I simply go to debug and debug file. One of the tricky things about NetBeans that you'll find if you're trying to do this at home, if you've clicked over in this left pane over here, and you go to debug, that's a bad example. A debug file is not always available depending on what context you've clicked in. So make sure you click onto a file over here on the left or in the file on the right. So we're going to start debugging the file. What it does is sends my browser out a request to that web page with all the query string events I have on it. The magic here is that it puts this extra argument on the query string. Xdebug session start triggers to the Xdebug module within PHP that what we want to do is send out a request back to my IDE and have my IDE step through the code one line at a time. Pretty cool stuff. So now the web page execution is actually stopped on line 2 right here. Have you guys used, or have many of you used debuggers for C and other languages in the past? A lot of folks that come to PHP have used the good old Borland C compiler, Visual Basic, or any of that stuff.
Turbo C.
Turbo C, it works a lot the same way. You have several options here. You can step over, meaning I want to execute that require once without drilling down into it. You can step into, which means I want to execute that, but drop me into the first line of that file once you've loaded it. You can step out, which means I want to jump out of the current context, whether that's a method, function, or file, and then you can jump to cursor. So let's jump to cursor here because we can be mashing, what you'll normally end up doing is hitting step over to move directly through the file you're looking at. And we can be mashing the button quite a bit to get to where we want to be. So I know that this file right here doesn't have, I'm going to maximize this code view. This file has a lot of interesting stuff going on at the top, but none of it's probably inserting that debug. We're loading our caching engine. There's no cache engine installed on this particular server, so we're saying cache none. We're grabbing the input, a lot of stuff there. We don't really care about that, so we're going to jump down to the cursor on line 36, or the first executable line thereafter. And apparently I moved too slow and it went without me. So I'm just going to use F8 to move through here so we can actually watch as it goes. So it's getting the variable off the query string. That's fine and good. If you look at the strategy we've employed here, the first argument on the query string is the URL that we want to capture. Every argument after that, it's not key value pair, it's just a series of keys. And the keys are the values that we want to search for. So this key is iPhone, plasma, cordless, etc. So we're just shifting the first one for there. That's probably not going to do it. We're filtering data. Here we are deconstructing the feed and breaking it down into individual RSS entry elements. No, this is, we don't know what this is. We want to step out of it. And what I'm actually going to do here is add a breakpoint and run to there. Okay. We continue to step through the file here, and well, there it is. Okay, so moving line by line through our file, I found this debug output here. That we want to be able to get rid of. So by deleting that and telling IDE to finish executing. We have output that, if it were to go for me, now has no more debug. If I can get rid of that colon, now has no more debug. Okay? So that's debugging in a nutshell. It's a very few simple principles that allow you to do really powerful things. And of course, this code is very linear, very not object oriented, but it's a good example that allows you to step down from top to bottom. And at this point, you've got a rough overview of what the code does. So it's kind of slow though. When I hit refresh here, it takes a long time. Part of that is because it's a really large feed that's downloading from Amazon. It's, I believe, almost a meg of XML. And part of it is, it has to do a lot of intense calculations here. There are dozens of nodes that it has to go through. We are applying, let's see, I didn't count them, but I think it was something like 6 searches, some of them with multiple arguments on them. It's quite a bit of stuff going on. Maybe there's some way that we can improve the performance here. So what I'm going to do is create a valgrind file. Valgrind is the name of a, I believe it's a opcode output format that it's read in by various tools, including Kcache grind for Linux, valgrind for Windows, and webgrind for anybody who happens to have a web server running. These files have really detailed data on all the things that happen during the execution of your PHP script, and it really helps you figure out what's taking so long and what you can do to improve your code. So let's have a look at webgrind now. So I've created a whole bunch of grinds already. I'll go into how you trigger the grind output momentarily, but let's just have a look at a simple one from earlier today. Alright, so what we have here is a list of everything that happened in this script, both PHP internal function calls and constructs within the code. This colorful bar here is a visual breakdown of how your code is constructed. Blue indicates internal PHP functions, orange, let's see, there are a couple of other colors that indicate include and require class methods, and then orange is procedural functions. So as you can tell, this code is almost entirely procedural with a bunch of calls to PHP's built-in functions. Let's switch from % of execution time over to microseconds so we can get a good view of what's taking longest. And I'm going to sort this by total inclusive cost to get an idea of which functions in here are actually the parents of the code that are taking the most time. And so what we see is that the overall code execution that's covered by main took this amount of time, and then everything of course adds up to that amount. Fetch URL is the process of grabbing the feed from the internet, so that took roughly half the time, a little bit under half the time that the entire script took to execute. Then there's the curl exec is actually part of this fetch URL, and then we're using this PHP split eye and a couple of methods in here to filter the RSS data. I'm going to introduce you to a tool called Kcache grind I mentioned a moment ago that gives us an even prettier visual representation of what's going on there. Does anybody have any questions so far? think so, the wonders of X11, we're able to execute this application that's actually running off the Linux VM in the outer Mac world, which is pretty handy.
So that's the Ubuntu VM.
That's-
Ubuntu's running on. Where's the Ubuntu running?
The Ubuntu is running inside this, inside the Mac right now. Okay, so a little bit more colors right off the bat. It's a little bit more visually appealing. Oh, but it gets prettier. I like this tool because it gives you a nice visual representation of the everything that goes on in a way that you can tell at a glance what's consuming all the processing time. You can see here that preg grep it's a huge chunk of this overall processing time. It's basically what we're doing is we're taking every entry in the RSS feed, we're running a grep on it with every one of those line items that we entered as searches. Let's have a look into preg grep. So it's a nice tool.
That's a built-in function?
It's a built-in function. We are, I think we're using it to good effect here, but the problem with pregs is that they're really powerful search tools when really all we want to do is find Miley Cyrus in a blob of text. That's kind of like using a sledgehammer to pound in a small nail. It's not really necessary. A lot of people learn the power of regular expressions early on. They use them to great effect, but when the load really hits their website, they find that it's running pretty darn slow, and regular expressions may have a lot to do with that. So if you're doing simple text searches, perhaps there might be a better way. My preg grep here is happening in this function I've called grep RSS entries. And we can quickly go over the structure of this function. What we're doing is taking all of the greps or searches that we entered in that box originally, iterating across those, and then searching the list of RSS entries with that. Then recombining the entire list of RSS entries that matched and returning it. Sorting it, of course, by its original order. I created this other set of functions down here called filter RSS entry list, and then a couple of helpers down below. There are more lines overall here. There are more functions, but what it does is a really simple stir case insensitive pause, stir I pause. It is a lot less sexy than a regular expression, but let's compare it side by side with that grind. Let's see, this file number was 3609. Okay, grep mode took a total of 2.8 seconds. So profile scan mode, I ran another Xdebug output, and this is the difference. So just flipping back and forth, we notice immediately 2.8 seconds to execute in grep mode. Scan mode, basically these are just variables I stuck at the end of the query string to help me identify one Xdebug output from another. Scan mode took 1.8 seconds. Drilling down here, filter RSS entry. Again, that was the main function here. Or filter RSS entry list took a total of 9.46% execution time. We jump back to the grep version. And look at that percent. 36% of execution time. So Xdebug helped us find an inefficient algorithm and confirm the fact that it was inefficient, because me just telling you that regular expressions are slow, it's not always true. And this is a great way to quantify how much slower they are if in fact they are slower. So let's make our own grinds. I'm going to delete, get all these other ones out of our way. All right, I also have on this little web server an installation of WordPress. So this is a dump of my poor sad blog. It looks better on the web. I don't use this skin, thankfully. But WordPress is a beast. If you've ever used it, you know that you need to do a fair number of tweaks to it to survive a slash dotting or a digging or even a Facebooking, depending on what kind of machine you're running your box on. It's great software, but as it turns out, it has a few things that you need to change about it out of the box to improve its scalability. So we're going to create a Xdebug output here. And the trigger in Xdebug to create a grind file is to put the query string value Xdebug profile with no value. It runs, creates that. That's a random image. It changes every time it goes up. That's that deal. And let's have another look at our grinds. Okay, there's our grind file. This one takes a little while. It's pretty beefy. So it took about 2.3 seconds to load that index page with about 10 blog entries in there. And let's sort things by the most, we're already sorted by the most expensive functions added up by all the times they were executed. And it looks like apply filters is pretty expensive. Sanitize post, a bunch of, you see more colors here, a bunch of functions. WordPress is highly procedural because it needs to be PHP 4 compatible. But it does, as you see here in the green, have some objects built in there. Not a lot. So mostly looks like templating and output stuff, which is reasonable. I mean, it's a CMS. Let's have a look at this in Kcache grind and see what's really going on. So I love Kcache grind because things get real pretty in a hurry the more complicated your project gets. And this is a separate pane down here, but you can look at these blocks and they're organized hierarchically, of course. So you can see that this overall rectangle here is a pretty big chunk of the processing. This one's a pretty big chunk, this one, but what's this over here? Anytime you see a large chunk of solid color, that took a long time, and it may be worth looking into. So let's have a look at that. Okay, so what we're doing here is it looks like we're loading the config file. Kcache grind is actually pretty stinking powerful. Let's have a look at the source code that it executed there. And line by line, what this does is tells us how much execution time. Right now it's telling us the percentage of the absolute execution time that each line took. So just executing this PHP file took 55% of this entire blog page load. Scrolling down here, you can see which lines are more expensive. Preg match was one of the more expensive lines in this file. They have a timer that appears to take a decent chunk of time. Ironic. Looks like they're instantiating their database, and that's probably the most expensive call so far. So this is a very valuable tool. I think if you run this on any one of your pages, you can see, you can optimize 1, maybe 2 lines right off the bat. Find better ways to do one of the things you're doing. And so it's easy to make fun of WordPress, but WordPress also makes a really great demonstration of just how powerful this Kcache grind tool is. So we've looked at the pyramid there. Let's now look at the call graph, which I think is actually the best part of Kcache grind. So what we have here is a visual map of the entire call world of this script, and it breaks it down with that little tiny bar there showing you how much execution time each node took. And if you follow it through this way, it looks like most of the execution time was, much of the execution time was consumed by this themes loader file. So let's take a look at that. So by double clicking that, they made it appear in the callee map on top. And we're seeing a lot of the stuff we saw before. Apply filters, if I mouse over just the right point here. We can use the call graph down below to see where I clicked. Okay, so that's apply filters. This one's sidebars, whatnot. So WordPress spends a lot of time, of course, building the display out for you. There's no caching whatsoever running on this server, so every single page load sends you through this whole process. If you install the basic WordPress caching plugin, a lot of the stuff goes away, which is really nice. But that's an illustration of the sort of things you can do with the Kcache grind tool. And that's profiling in a nutshell. There's one other feature that I use quite a bit with Xdebug, and that's an enhanced output. So go ahead.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So a tool like this, let's suppose you just do a real simple like 10 entries, 10 articles, and you did it like all the same, Joomla, Drupal, WordPress, Django. Who would come out the best, or what would you think?
That's a really good question. I haven't tested any of them out. I think anybody who does will get a lot of hits to their blog post about it.
Do they cache pages? I mean, that's.
By default?
Can you turn that on?
Oh, absolutely. It's a plugin that you have to download, but WordPress has actually made it pretty easy these days, where you can go into their admin interface and just via point and click download and install plugins without ever even logging into SSH. It's pretty cool.
That should dramatically improve things like that.
Definitely. Having that installed, having APC, those things make basically any CMS run a lot better. But most CMSs benefit considerably from static file caching, where they just load the entire page up and write it out to a file, because it's not going to change until you make another post, generally speaking.
So the White House uses Drupal.
Does it really?
Yeah.
Just switch.
Interesting.
That's an advocate.
That's a ringing endorsement.
Is it?
They get a lot of traffic, at least.
Yeah.
All right, so we're back at our feed sifter tool, and
It's PHP based,
what I'm going to do here is add a little bit of debug output, so we can just have a look at the variables that we're going into there, Xdebug style. Okay, so we've got our feed ready to roll. Let's have a look at the code here, index.php. So we're curious about, we've got this debug here, and this debug, judging by the looks of it, it does a whole lot of nothing really. It iterates through a bunch of stuff, but it does take a really close look at the variables as they pass through there. So let's see what that does for us. Okay, so this is what Xdebug looks like. when you have errors that normally show up on PHP. They're basically an ugly error format with a bold message and a little bit of italics there. Xdebug takes it to the next level. They add colors, which is fancy. They link to user documentation anytime they can. And they give you lots of information that you would not otherwise have with a standard variable output. This is with trigger error. Another valuable feature in Xdebug is it takes over the function vardump. Many of you, I'm sure, use vardump to have a good look at any variable that's passing through your hands. When we were stepping through the code earlier, what we could have done is clicked on any variable and looked at the contents of it there. But let's say we don't have time, we're not set up to do remote debugging. You can use vardump to, say, look at all the bits. That appears to be a variable we have defined. So here's what our bits look like. This is a little bit prettier than the standard bar dump. It adds a bit of color for you. It gets even more advanced when you throw objects its way. I've got a very, very simple object that I can show you, but one of the coolest features I just wanted to illustrate here is that it's actually truncating the data down to a usable length. I think we get the point at this point, what's going on here. So it's not necessary for them to go to the full length of that line, but we can see here that there are 127 elements in this. No, okay, it's more because it's truncated. Thank goodness.
Can you get it to print the full?
Let's find out. It would appear that. Oh, right. Well, let's actually look at the documentation. That'll do us more better. Xdebug documentation, great segue actually, is very handy. It's on xdebug.org. They hide a couple of the most valuable features at the very bottom of their docs page. You'll find yourself looking at the all configuration settings and all functions fairly often. Let me actually look at all functions right now. Okay. It would appear that it gives you no options. Oh, okay. There are a couple of settings. Yeah, at runtime, thank you. There are no options. You can change them in your PHP INI or in your Apache vhost, HGDocs files. Any place you have control of that.
So is that the display max children then?
Display max children, display max data, max depth.
So you can presumably.
Yes. And while we're here, while we're thinking about settings, let's have a look at the setting files that we've used to configure all this. So there are a bunch of settings in here. Get the junk out of the way. There are very few that you actually need to configure to make things work. For profiling, you need a small suite. By default, it outputs, I believe, to the temp directory. I want it to go to the specific directory, so I defined it here. Enable trigger allows us to use the Xdebug profile query string variable instead of making it dump out an Xdebug file on every single load. That's a word of warning. If you turn on Xdebug, you can enable debugging by default with this profiler enable and default enable flags. If both of those set to true, every single page load will result in an Xdebug file. That'll fill up your temp directory in a hurry, especially if you've got a pretty busy site or WordPress blog. I also recommend changing your cache grind file output name to something more useful like this. You can have a look in the docs at all the arguments that are available there, but this tells us the Apache process ID, the host name that it was called, and the full file name. Those things are all useful, especially if you've got a server where you've got multiple vhosts running on it, and you want to keep all these grants straight. Remote debugging is also simple. A lot of these are actually the default values. The ones you really need to get the job going is remote enable, remote auto start, remote handler is default DBGP, remote mode is by default. Looks like everything else except for remote host is default values. Remote host is important because remember, Apache is calling out to your IDE. Your IDE opens up a port and acts like a server, so it's waiting for a call from your web server. That means that if you enable remote debugging, you can't have more than one person debugging on your server at a time unless you set up vhosts or whatever with different variables for remote host in their PHP configs. Make sense? And that's about it for configuration.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of configuration flags for what it dumps out when there's an error. Because I have like lots of them turned on.
Indeed. Could you?
So there's xdebug.dump. And you can tell it whether you want the environment to get the post the cookie files. And it's set to equal star, and I don't remember what equal star means, other than it must not filter.
There you go. Again, all configuration settings is your resource for finding out exactly how to configure these things. There's quite a bit of options that can go into your PHP INI file. And as demonstrated here, this is actually a really small taste of what's going on the screen right now. All right. Finally, other features that I haven't covered tonight. Code coverage is actually pretty powerful. Code coverage basically shows you, outputs an array of every line that was executed during processing. It is not interesting or pretty to look at as a person. That doesn't really say much to me. But automated tools can use this code coverage output here to say, tell you what lines were executed during a debug cycle, or most importantly, what lines were executed during unit tests. So if you say write a batch of unit tests and you want to make sure that you've got most or the important parts of your section of your code covered, you will use code coverage tools. There's lots more information on how to set up with code coverage here. And that is all I have on Xdebug. Do we have any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Well, I guess I come from the Java world, so I'm a little bit spoiled as far as profiling options go. One thing I didn't notice you mentioned, and I'm not sure if Xdebug even has the capabilities to do memory usage profiling.
It does have basic memory usage profiling. Perhaps not, I'm sure nowhere near as good as Java because we don't have the full VM available to us.
Yeah, like being able to know, well, you know, at any particular point in the execution, what's using the memory and you know, what's referencing what. I've looked maybe half a year ago for tools that let me do it, and I could not find anything. Except for the most rudimentary things like number of objects.
Your remote debugger will actually, it has the capabilities to tell you information like that when you're running in real time. So let's delete this cruft here and give it another run. We can have a look at what information it gives us when we do debugging. Debugging is started. Okay. So let's start with our call stack. And what we'd expect to see at this point is output in each of these windows telling us a little bit of information about what's going on there. here that I may have given it a broken breakpoint. It doesn't like that. So we can see our variables are growing there, our call stack. And let's see if we can drill down in there and find out specific information about memory. That's a really good question. It's something I actually haven't done myself. We're learning together. Let's see, we opened up threads, I believe, and that had no good information for us. Well, I can't tell you any more information about that at the moment, but I do know that you can use inline, single-line calls to tell you things like how much memory PHP overall is.
I've done that, and even that, because the garbage collection is not guaranteed, it's kind of hard to tell exactly what it is being used, Actually kind of surprising, given that PHP is such a memory hog when it comes to its own internal objects, that it's very difficult to query the application to figure out exactly where the majority of memory is being used. That's really what I've resorted to, is printing out memory usage throughout the lifetime of the application to be able to determine this type of information. I've looked at tools, I even asked them, like Stack Overflow, and nobody could answer.
That's something we can actually, I'll tweet to Derek Redmond tonight and see if he can give us some information on that. I'll post something to the group if we get a response from it.
Maybe some of us just didn't build into their to the engine.
That's possible.
They need to build in.
Any other questions?
Question. The problem I have tends to be getting it configured with my editor and then triggering a session.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're doing, in your example, it's a pretty, you're doing the index.php. What if you're doing something like CodeIgniter where you've got the front controller, you got all these other files loading in, and I want to go debug a controller or a model or a view file. Is there a way to trigger it so that it starts debugging in an included or required file?
Absolutely.
Or does it always have to be from the first page?
Of course, it always starts at the beginning, but what you can use are breakpoints. By clicking on the line number here, if you've used NetBeans, you probably experience, and especially if you're new to NetBeans, you probably experience this frustrating UI feature where you click on a line number and the line turns red and you're like, what the heck is that? That is your breakpoint for debugging. A lot of IDEs actually use that feature, but you can stick a breakpoint anywhere in your code execution line. And as soon as the debug gets to that point, it'll stop, bring your attention to it.
Okay.
And you can move from there.
And I think you made one thing, you can also, he initiated it through the string at the top, but there's also functionality you can put within your code to trigger, like start profiling, I think, or something, to trigger through functions, so you can tell it, just start profiling this section of code. So you're not
profiling or debugging?
The profiling portion of it, not the debugging, I guess, but the profiling portion, you can actually put functions in your code to start and stop. So you could actually get a file just for one area you want to focus on if you want.
Okay.
Per se.
That'd be this line here, debug break. So that's a manual code breakpoint that you could they could add in there, if that's what you'd like to do.
Now, in order for that to work, do you have to have the Xdebug in the URL?
No, you shouldn't have to have the Xdebug in the URL. What you would have to do though is have your IDE ready and waiting for the debug output to come to it.
Okay.
In NetBeans, you have to actually tell it to go into debugging mode and the server contact it.
Okay.
And by pressing debug file here, that actually tells it to do that. I believe, I actually haven't used that approach. Do you know if attached debugger is what you've used it to take that way?
I'm not 100% sure there.
Okay. This doesn't look like it. In that case, what I might recommend doing is starting debugging a particular file and then not following that debug path, firing it up in the debug instance or loading up another browser.
My editor doesn't have a built-in debugger, so I'll sometimes put the start and stops and get the cache grind file and look through those manually, or with web grind or something, so that's
And-
just.
That actually is a good point. Not all IDEs have it, but many IDEs do. And they have a list here of all the IDEs that support remote debugging, or many of them, I should say. NetBeans, of course, Notepad++, and there are actually a few that aren't listed here, but if yours is on this list, PHP Eclipse, you're ready to go.
Yeah.
Or should be with the installation of a couple of plugins.
Like the web cache grind he has installed, you don't need any debugging in your editor or anything to use that. You can just throw that on your server and use it, load the files, and view that stuff easily.
This is what the grind file looks like on the outside. And these files are portable. You can generate them on one machine and stick them on a machine with web grind, like you were saying. They can get, like I was saying earlier, they can get pretty big, 4.3 megs for this WordPress one. A lot smaller for simpler scripts, several K, several hundred K.
And if you are using the manual method, don't leave it out on a public server. You can crash your server really quickly because it takes a lot of memory to build those files. And if you publish a URL to something you're testing with that on, and more than 5 people go to your site, your server mysteriously disappears from the internet.
It also slows down the execution of the script.
It does.
Yes.
This is just a look at the exciting life of cache grind.
Why do you move those around? How do you use those? You're talking about developing with other people?
You might develop with other people. You might put them on a remote server that doesn't, for example, have web grind installed. You don't want to install it. If you have a remote server, you can generate a grind file, FTP it down to your computer, and then use Kcache grind on it.
Just to analyze it and look at it.
That's right.
So it's Xdebug that's making the grind file? Which one's making the grind file?
Xdebug is making the grind file.
And then these other tools, the web grind is remote to look at it, and the excuse me, Kcache grind is local.
That's correct.
Okay.
And WebGrind, if you run it on the box that you actually generated the grind file in the first place, it's pretty convenient. It just reads in the configurations for Xdebug, and it knows where those grind files are automatically. That's why I moved the old ones into a different direction, to just kind of clear up the clutter for us. And it's almost zero configuration in many instances. There is zero configuration in many instances. WebGrind, unfortunately, is not very well documented on their Google Code site, but there are many blog posts out there. A quick Google search will take you many tutorials if you have any other questions on them. All right, thank you very much for your questions and for paying attention.